What if I told you that Chicago is actually the safest city in its region of the country? Perhaps you've been brainwashed by Fox News and you think that Chicago is a dangerous city. The homicide rate for Chicago is 22 people out of every 100,000. That makes it safer than St. Louis at 53, Indianapolis at 25, Louisville at 25, Cincinnati at 25, Cleveland at 33, and Detroit at 41. And that's after Detroit and St. Louis had a massive decline. Compared to other cities in its region of the country, Chicago really isn't that dangerous. So why does it have such a bad reputation? A recent news article claims 18 murders in one day, the most murderous day Chicago has ever seen in 60 years. The number 18 homicides in one day does sound scary and intimidating until you remember that there are nearly 3 million people that live in the city of Chicago. The city of Birmingham, Alabama recently had 7 homicides in one day. While that doesn't sound as terrible as 18, when you keep in mind that there's only 200,000 people in Birmingham, for Chicago to match the same rate by population, there would have to be 133 people killed in a single day in Chicago for it to match the violence of Birmingham, Alabama in a single day. And that should just give you an idea. We're talking 18, it would have to be 133. We can see that violence in other cities is significantly higher by rate. Look, if you don't know what a rate is, this is something you should have learned in like the 3rd grade. I'm not going to explain to you what a rate is. If you're a grown adult and you don't know what a rate is, you should seriously consider going back to the 3rd grade. Now, there are particular neighborhoods in Chicago, if they were their own city, their violence would be no different than Detroit or St. Louis. But as the city of Chicago sits today, their homicide rate is about half what other large cities in the region are, like Detroit and St. Louis. So you may ask yourself, why doesn't Detroit and St. Louis end up being the pun of every conservative joke? The truth is that those cities don't match the political narrative. Thus, the reason Chicago is pushed and labeled as a dangerous city is only to convey a conservative political agenda that doesn't even line up with analytics. If we were really going to find a city to be the pun of all jokes, cities like Jackson, Mississippi, Montgomery, Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama, Baton Rouge, Louisiana would make much better candidates. Now, right-wing media has been pushing an agenda to demonize California, Chicago, and any city that is Democratic or state. And thus, there's a misinformation campaign that people are running with, and they'll take these things as literal. If we were really going to talk about a dangerous state, California wouldn't even be on the top half of the 25th worst states. It would be in the bottom half. States like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana would much rather fit that image. However, you never hear those states mentioned because, again, this misinformation is coming from a political ideology, and many times people repeat these things and they're not even aware that they're spreading false political propaganda. It's really important before you repeat something you hear on Fox News or CNN that you first check the real information and see if what you're repeating is based off of real information or if it's coming from a political agenda. Because many times people repeat these things and demonize places like Chicago and California, not aware that they are spreading political propaganda. Now, I couldn't tell you how many times in a day in my YouTube channel I see people mention stuff like Chicago is dangerous. It's like they believe if they repeat it enough, it becomes true. And sadly, in the minds of people, it really does become true. Now, we're passing on the left an area known as O Block. It is one of the most notorious neighborhoods in Chicago and in the United States. This is definitely a dangerous area. Now, the state of Illinois is definitely not a saint among states. It's actually pushing the top of the list of the most dangerous places. And the city of Chicago, with 3 million people, shouldn't have a homicide rate that high. There's years where they're pushing nearly 700 homicides. And while that sounds like a large number, keep in mind that other small cities like Louisville, Baton Rouge, Birmingham are getting close to 200 homicides with a 20th of the population, with a 10th of the population, with a sixth of the population. Thus, we're starting to see that Chicago, by rate and by number, really isn't the worst place you could be. Chicago's homicide rate is about 3 times the national average, and there's nothing to be proud about that. It is definitely a concerning figure. But with cities like Jackson, Mississippi and Birmingham, Alabama having a rate 4 times higher, should Chicago really be the butt of all jokes when it comes to this topic? I mean, you have other cities even within that region of the country like St. Louis and Detroit that are several times more dangerous by homicide rate. So I did a search of the word Chicago on my YouTube channel, and this is the most recent comment just 7 hours ago. Somebody from Titusville, Florida said, "Bro's acting like these are the main streets of Chicago." Well, remember that the homicide rate in Chicago was 22? Titusville, Florida's murder rate is actually 20. That's not much of a difference. So this person in the comment section is saying, hey, you're being ridiculous. You're acting like this is Chicago. But Titusville, Florida, the town that he's defending, has a homicide rate that's about the same as Chicago. In fact, even though they only have 50,000 people, they've had 10 homicides. And that's really the stupidity of people who make a pun out of the city of Chicago for these jokes, when in reality, the reality is that the town that you're living in isn't much better. In the case of comparing Titusville, Florida to Chicago, it's about the same homicide rate. So what are you laughing at? You're laughing at me saying, oh, you're acting like this is Chicago, but it turns out that your town is just as dangerous in Chicago, but you're not even aware that it's dangerous. So perception is an interesting thing. Sometimes people repeat stuff they hear on the media. Like this person lives in Titusville, Florida. They might be listening to their sheriff's officer from Brevard County. He goes on rant saying, the crime in Chicago is out of control. But his cities have the same exact murder rate. So it's very hypocritical in a lot of ways, the way things are portrayed. But what I'm trying to teach you on today's video is don't be that idiot who just repeats everything they hear on the radio or on TV or on YouTube and doesn't actually dive down and dissect the information to really understand what these numbers really mean. Because at the end of the day, this person's laughing at me like I'm the idiot, but the reality is that he's living in a city that is just as dangerous as Chicago, yet he doesn't even know it. The next comment is just somebody sending me love from Chicago. Hey, I love you back too. And then there's the nicknames like Chirac, Chiraccio, the Chiracoons, and all these other crazy things you hear on social media. People really do run with these narratives, but again, the reality is that Chicago doesn't rank among the scariest cities in the United States. In fact, in its region of the country, it's among one of the safest. And let's not forget that Chicago has economical advantages that Detroit, Indianapolis, and St. Louis do not have. It really is a great city for jobs, especially around the vicinity. Now, what's more interesting is that when you look back on many years and decades of homicide rates in Chicago, it really isn't a terrifying city like Detroit, New Orleans, St. Louis. Those are cities that actually year after year and decade after decade have ridiculous homicide rates. I remember growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, thinking that Chicago was a big, intimidating, scary city. But when you look back at the analytics, it actually hasn't been a bad city overall. It definitely has to fix a few things. I mean, 3 times the national average is still pretty bad. Most large cities are not going to be below the national average. You have cities like Miami and Los Angeles that are just above the national average. Large cities are always going to have more crime. If a large city is below the national average, then the real estate prices become tremendously expensive. We're talking Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, these cities like Boston as well that are below the national average are going to be extraordinarily expensive cities to live in because people want to live in a large city that's safe. Nothing will ruin your city living experience more than freaking crime, especially homicides and murders. This person who is subscribed to our channel is mad at me saying, how dare you compare San Francisco and Chicago to Bradenton, Florida? This person's accusing me of spreading lies and misinformation. How dare I compare Bradenton to San Francisco? I mean, just off the top of my head, I know that Bradenton's homicide rate is about 3 times higher than San Francisco's, so there really isn't an argument analytically to make here. But however, this person really genuinely believes that I'm out of line for even suggesting just a thing. And actually, the population of homeless within Bradenton, if Bradenton had San Francisco's population be about 12 times larger, yeah, it would be Bradenton with the larger homeless problem. But don't tell people that, it'll hurt their feelings. Now, I've seen a lot of YouTube creators run with this narrative, and they're YouTube creators that are smart enough to know that the cities that they are defaming are analytically among the safest in the country. And what I'm doing today isn't going to be popular, but I want to remind you guys that put away the political narratives, put away the misinformation. Let's look at real numbers. Cities like New York and San Francisco have homicide rates below the national average. That's exceptional for a large city. Now, this person's pointing a finger at Chicago, and what's interesting is they don't even live in the United States. They live in Merida, Mexico, and Yucatan. Beautiful town, and they're saying they live in the second safest city in North America. And it's interesting, you step back and look at North America. I mean, Canada is right across from Chicago. It's not that far away. Detroit's got a border with Canada. And what's crazy is that the city of Detroit on the U.S. side is one of the most dangerous cities in the country. Yet all you have to do is drive 2 hours into Toronto, and you are in the most safe city in all of North America. Now, this person claims that Merida, Mexico is the second safest city in North America. I don't really think so. I think anywhere in Canada is going to be safer than Mexico, regardless of the stereotypes that Mexico has. It does have cities like Merida down in Yucatan that are safe and beautiful, but I've also had family move through those areas, and what happens is that many people that disappear there are migrants, and those numbers don't get tracked. So there's definitely a big question mark with Merida, Mexico being safer than, let's say, Toronto or Quebec City or Montreal. But it's interesting to think that all you have to do is cross into Canada, and the cities there are an eighth of the U.S. national average when it comes to homicides. What does that tell you? That the United States as a whole is a dangerous country. You know, the violence in American cities has got so bad that now you really are starting to see cities in Mexico that are going to start to chart much safer than cities in the United States. I mean, if you told somebody in Mexico City to move to St. Louis or Detroit, their answer would be an absolute resounding no. They might say yes to Los Angeles or Miami, but they're not going to move to St. Louis or Detroit. Many of these American cities are so dangerous that even people in other countries are afraid. Now, this person mentioned the city of Chicago. Says, hey, I live in Mexico. Not a chance in the world I would live in Chicago. And go figure, the chances of you being murdered in Chicago analytically are more than 10 times higher than that in Merida, Mexico. So logically, this person has a lot of analytical reason to believe that. But the thing about Mexico is that regional stability can change very quickly. There are states that 10 years ago were safer than the United States, and today the entire state is in complete chaos. So in Mexico, regional stability can change very rapidly. So I wouldn't just blindly move to a place in Mexico because right now they're stable. All it takes is a shift in local government or criminal organizations, and your little state could be completely out of control. It's happened to a few states in Mexico. Tabasco, Colima, they were very safe states many years ago, and today they're a complete mess. And this person makes a solid point. The southern suburbs of Chicago or the south side compared to the northern suburbs, it's like a whole different planet. And that is what is interesting, that Chicago really does have great, amazing places to live, great suburbs on the north side. These are beautiful, safe areas, and it really is a shame that the whole metropolitan area of Chicago gets this horrendous reputation because so much emphasis is put on the south side, when in reality, Chicago really is a great city overall, and especially the northern side of the metro. But this is right about when people start tuning out of my video because it's not what they want to hear. They want to hear that it's violent, it's horrible. But when you remind them that there are some great places to live on the north side of the city and it really is overall a great metro with great opportunities, then they start clicking out because it's, again, not matching their narrative. Interesting how today a lot of people if it doesn't match their narrative, they don't even want to hear it. They don't even want to give a second of attention to something if it doesn't match their narrative. They just want to believe what they want to believe, whether it's factual or not. But on our YouTube channel, I want to give you guys a slice of reality in a world that is so controlling, and just literally everything is about controlling the perspective and the narrative. So when you see a YouTube channel like mine, it just strips away all that garbage. It just looks at real analytics and numbers and makes real comparisons that are logical. It turns a lot of people off because it's not what they want to hear. It's not what they're used to hearing. And they really don't like the notion that the news media they're getting isn't really coming from a very analytical and fair examination, but from some type of political narrative. And let's go back to this. Chicago is in a region of the country where all the cities are dangerous. And if we were to zoom out a little bit more, we would see cities like Memphis, Kansas City, that are also much more dangerous. Zoom out a little bit more, we'd see cities like Baltimore that are definitely more dangerous. But this misinformation is harmful because a lot of people would move to Chicago and would find great jobs and great communities and great people, and they don't move to this area because of the misinformation they're hearing from particular news sources that people believe it, they spread it, and it becomes general knowledge even though it's based around a complete lie. I like to give people the real narrative because I understand that my videos are helping people that are moving across the country, and I wouldn't want somebody to miss out on a great opportunity in Chicago because they heard some misinformation. Now, me personally, I wouldn't move to a city of 3 million people that has a homicide rate 3 times the national average. It wouldn't work for me. The real metric here is the national average. The national average, if you're 3 times higher than national average, I'm not moving to your city. I made that mistake when I moved to Montgomery, Alabama, and I hope to never make that mistake again. But what's interesting is that while living in Alabama, between cities like Montgomery, which have double Chicago's homicide rate, and Birmingham, which has 4 times the homicide rate. So these are cities that are several times more dangerous than Chicago. Many of the people that I met in Alabama would actually talk bad about Chicago, about how dangerous it is. And it would just make me scratch my head because even I knew, how could somebody in a city that's 2 or 4 times more dangerous look down on a city that's safer and say that city is dangerous? But again, you're controlling the narrative. Now, in my videos from Mississippi and Louisiana, I always have people say stuff like, well, at least we're not in Chicago. But did you know that the entire state of Mississippi and Louisiana are on par with Chicago? That means in any small rural town in Mississippi or Louisiana, you are just as likely to get killed as Chicago. So when you compare like the state of Mississippi, their homicide rate is like 20 per 100,000, which is just below 22 per 100,000 of Chicago. And Mississippi and Chicago have roughly about the same population. You know, a little bit here, give or take. It's about similar. Anywhere in Mississippi is as dangerous as Chicago. Yet people, let's say leaving California, would consider moving anywhere in Mississippi that they've never been to. If it's a small rural town, they just assume it's safe, but they don't do their analytical research. And this is the fine line where we are today. We have a situation now where a lot of people run with the misinformation and never really even give thought to the fact that perhaps a city like Chicago is safer than living in a small rural town in Mississippi. Places like Jackson, Mississippi are 4 times more likely to kill you than Chicago. You'll literally see more people out and about in Chicago when it's 19 degrees than you will on a beautiful day in Jackson, Mississippi. And that is because people are literally afraid to go outside in these cities. Montgomery, Jackson, Birmingham, even Memphis. People are literally afraid to go outside of their homes because these cities are so dangerous. Chicago, it can be 19 degrees and there's still people out and about because they're not afraid for their safety. And that's one thing that you'll notice about Chicago is even if it gets into the 20s in a winter day, people start walking around doing stuff. If it was really that dangerous like Birmingham or Jackson, Mississippi, not a chance in the world people would be outside. You know, throughout the whole world, cold weather places are usually safer. Canada, Finland, Denmark, when you get to the colder climates, you usually have safer places. Leave it up to the United States to not really believe in that. Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis. While we were in Chicago to have dinner there at a Cuban restaurant, somebody got killed right behind the restaurant. Violence is visible in Chicago, and there's one thing that makes Chicago different than other cities. It's how compact and how much population density you have in Chicago, where like something may happen on your block in Chicago, maybe in St. Louis it might be 5 or 6 blocks away. It doesn't affect you as much, but that is because the city of Chicago has a really high population density. Take, for example, Kansas City, Missouri. It's a very spread out city, or Oklahoma City. There are cities that are much more dangerous than Chicago, but they're much more spread out. Chicago is a very compact city. There really aren't even abandoned buildings or buildings that are unoccupied in Chicago. I mean, it's literally 4 and 5 stories of people living on top of each other in Chicago. And that population density means that you are more likely to drive past a murder scene in Chicago than you are in Kansas City. But when you analytically look at it, crime rates are by population. So despite the fact that Chicago is more compact, everything's in your face, you know, if you compare Chicago to like Kansas City or Oklahoma City, you'll notice that there's more vehicles, there's more building height. You know, you're more likely to be in proximity to crime in Chicago. But when you look at the numbers analytically, those other cities are still much more dangerous. And I feel like the fact that Chicago is so population density, it's so compact, it really makes it feel like Chicago is somewhat more dangerous than what it really is, because you're literally going through more crime scenes, you're seeing more things happen. Just take a look at how compact this particular neighborhood in Chicago is. It's not exactly a bad neighborhood, it's kind of a middle ground neighborhood, but look at the population density. You have 4-story apartments right up against each other, there's not a lot of easements. That means that you're just around a lot more people. So the population density in Chicago means that your proximity to some of these crime scenes is going to be a lot more than, let's say, Oklahoma City. In Oklahoma City, people that would make the same income level as these people here are going to be in properties that are much more spread out. The houses are going to be much further from each other. And it's that population density, even in nicer areas of Chicago, that makes it feel like you're right on top of these crime scenes. Let's just strip away everything above the first floor. If it was just the first floor, okay, forget about the fact that's a 7-story building. If only the housing units on the first floor were occupied, Chicago would still have a higher population density than many of these other cities like Detroit, which is literally vacant. I mean, Detroit has entire blocks that don't have anybody. St. Louis doesn't have the same population density, has a lot of abandoned buildings. So the issue with Chicago is the population density. And that population density, in the case of 4-story apartments like this, means that it's not just one layer of people, it's 4 layers of people. And that means that a neighborhood like this, if somebody were to be killed, keep in mind, it's not just one layer of people. You got 4 layers of people. So per square mile, Chicago does seem like a very scary city. The amount of homicides per square mile really would be shocking in Chicago. But keep in mind that by rate, more things are happening in Detroit, St. Louis, or Kansas City. They're just so thinly spread apart because there isn't that much population density. And I think in that, Chicago, if you live there, can seem a lot scarier because, again, it's a very dense city. A lot of people stacked on top of each other. In other words, if I were driving through, let's say, Detroit, which is less population density, 1 hour of driving through Chicago, you would see more people than 10 hours of driving through Detroit, let's say. So what you see in 1 hour in Chicago may be overwhelming if you're coming from a place like Detroit, because Detroit, despite being more dangerous, to see the same amount of people, you would have to drive 12 hours to Detroit to see as many people as you're going to see driving through just 1 hour of Chicago. And that's why a lot of people do get the perception that Chicago is a more dangerous city when you visit it, but you have that layer of every single building is just that compact. So the population density of Chicago is 12,000 people per every square mile. That means that per every square mile in Chicago, there are 2.6 homicides. So if you had 3 people killed within 1 square mile of where you live, yeah, you would be scared of your freaking life. But you have to remember that it's a trick that population density plays on your mind. When you think about, well, 3 people have got killed within a mile of my house every single year, that is definitely intimidating, and it's the reality of Chicago. The city of Chicago is 234 square miles, but it has had 700 murders in the last year. And most of those murders are happening in the same area, which means that more dangerous parts of the city, you can have within a 1 square mile area 10, 9, 12 people being killed. That is overwhelming. And I think it's that proximity due to population density in Chicago that makes the city appear to me more dangerous than what it really is. Chicago and Detroit have the same number of homicides per square mile. Chicago's population density is 2.6 times higher than Detroit, but at the same time, Chicago has 2.6 murders per square mile, which means that literally Chicago and Detroit have the same number of homicides per square mile. The problem is that within that square mile in Detroit, you have 4.6 thousand people, while in Chicago you have about 12,000. So the murder density in general per square mile throughout the city in Chicago and Detroit are exactly the same. Thus, that makes a lot of people feel that Chicago really is on par with Detroit when it comes to homicides, because after all, every single square mile has exactly the same amount of murders. A great example would be Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City only has 1,000 people per square mile. So if you live in Oklahoma City, you might have to go 10 miles to see a homicide scene, where in Chicago it would literally be less than a mile away from your house. And we see how population density really distorts the perception of how safe or dangerous an area is. The homicide rate in Oklahoma City is considerably higher than Chicago, but in Chicago, you might be 3 blocks away from the closest murder scene, while in Oklahoma City, even though it's more dangerous, it might be 6 miles to the nearest homicide scene, because the population density in Chicago is 12 times higher than Oklahoma City. So despite the fact that Oklahoma City is much more dangerous than Chicago, it's just a spread out city that perhaps you're not going to be that close to the nearest homicide scene. Let me just clarify, that's recently because Oklahoma City had a bad year. Historically, Oklahoma City has been safer than Chicago, but it's recently had a bad year. But you get the idea of how population density would play a role into just the perception of how dangerous a place is versus the reality. I use Oklahoma City as an example because of its population density being so low. But for example, Kansas City has been consistently more dangerous than Oklahoma City. It would have made a much better example, but I'm just using Oklahoma City as an example so you can see how population density would play a role in perception of crime. And I'm saying that because I used the analytic for one specific year for Oklahoma City, but looking at it historically, Oklahoma City has had a lower homicide rate than Chicago, with the exception or if the confusion that Oklahoma City's city boundaries expand really far out into the suburbs, where Chicago is more fragmented. And so it's all, again, back to perception. This is the small town of Idabel, Oklahoma. You've probably never heard about this place. In 2018, its homicide rate was 43 per 100,000, about double Chicago's homicide rate. Because it has a smaller population, there's years where the homicide rate is 0 and it can claim, we're the safest city in the world. And then there's years like 2007, 2008, and 2018 where their homicide rate is more than double that of Chicago. The problem is that 1 square mile in Chicago literally has more people than this town does. In fact, if you were to cut it into quarters, 1/4 of a square mile in Chicago may have more people than this entire town. And this is really where the misconception comes in with crime, where somebody in a small town says, well, we haven't had a murder here in 3 years. It's safer than Chicago. But then on that 4th year, you have 2 homicides, and now your little town in Oklahoma is 3 times more dangerous than Chicago. And that's after you average it out after 4 years. And this with population density is what sometimes deceives a lot of people by thinking that their small little towns are these great havens of safety. But in reality, it's because if your town has 5,000 people, you know, even if you have a murder every other year, it's still more dangerous than Chicago per capita, per person, per rate. Another great example would be Kansas City, Missouri, where there's only 1,500 people per square miles, a little bit less than 1/10 of the population density of Chicago. That should just give you an idea that a city can be more dangerous than Chicago, but if its population density is different, the perception may be that Kansas City is safer. And I do want to make this little note for you guys. Analytics for homicide rates, for some reason that I don't understand, vary from one chart to the next. And sometimes cities do try to manipulate or hide these analytics. I think sometimes older analytics are much better to use than the recent ones, because in the last few years, manipulation of information has been used greatly to distort the way cities are portrayed. They're all in battle to see who's better, and recently it seems like even real analytics like homicide rates are being distorted, since I'm finding contradictory information. In the case of Oklahoma City, I find one that says it's 15 and I find another one that says it's 34, so it's like, which one is right? So let's skip on using Oklahoma City as an example. Let's do the same exact idea but with Kansas City, and hopefully it paints a more accurate picture, because it really seems like the information for Oklahoma City is inconsistent. When you compare Chicago to Kansas City, however, you can see that Kansas City is considerably more dangerous by homicide rate than Chicago. But the population density in Chicago is 12,000 people per square mile, while it's only 1,500 people per square mile in Kansas City. So even though Kansas City has, let's say, 1.4 times more homicides than Chicago, which is significantly more, I mean, that may not be visually appreciated when you say, oh, it's just 1.4 times more when you look at it on a city grid, but in general, it is considerably more, right? Despite the fact Kansas City is considerably more dangerous, it's got roughly a tenth of the population density. So if it's a tenth of the population density, but only 1.4 times more homicides, you could very easily live in Kansas City and live in Chicago and see 5 to 6 times more homicides in a year in your neighborhood in Chicago than you will in Kansas City. And that's probably the best way that I can explain this, because there's always a comment like, well, I've lived in Chicago and now I live in Kansas City and I feel so much safer here. I haven't seen a single murder here. In Chicago, 3 people got killed on my block where I used to live in the first year or whatever. But then it's like, well, yes, but the population density in Chicago is 10 times more. So, of course, you're going to have more proximity to those crimes. And I think that distorts information, and not so much the information, but the perception that people have with cities like Chicago is that even when they move out of Chicago to somewhere more dangerous, they may actually think that the more dangerous place is safer, but it's really not. It's just that these cities are more spread out. Here's another great example, Jacksonville, Florida. Now, Jacksonville, Florida, to me, is a terrifying city. Jacksonville, Florida is still, by homicide rate, safer than Chicago. So, take the example of Jacksonville. I've only been to Chicago a few times. I'm not that familiar with Chicago, but I'm very familiar with Jacksonville. I'm in Jacksonville all the time. Jacksonville is analytically safer than Chicago, but Jacksonville absolutely scares the crap out of me. In fact, I was recently at a hotel in Jacksonville. While I was sleeping, I heard a gunshot. Somebody literally got killed outside of my hotel in Jacksonville the last time I was there. We heard the gunshot and heard cars screeching their wheels and leaving, and we didn't really think it was a shooting until the next day when we saw the news and we're like, remember what we heard last night? Yeah, somebody got killed right outside of our hotel just the last time that we were in Jacksonville. I am by no means saying that Chicago is a safe city. Jacksonville is safer than Chicago, and it scares the crap out of me. But Jacksonville's population density, from an analytical perspective, is a tenth of Chicago's. Now, that's very misleading because the entire Duval County is city limits, but not all of Duval County is actually urban. Possibly, maybe just, I don't know, like a third of Duval County is actually urban, but the whole Duval County is city limits. So the idea that Jacksonville, by square mileage, has less homicides would be very deceptive, because 2/3 of Duval County is wooded areas and only 1/3 of it is actually the urban core. So that's a little misleading. But in reality, on a square mile basis, it's probably as dangerous in Chicago as it is in Jacksonville. Even though Jacksonville has a lower population density and a lower homicide rate, you know, if you're actually in Jacksonville, if you're actually in Chicago, it would probably be just as dangerous. So sometimes analytical information can be really misconstrued, especially with like a city like Jacksonville where, okay, the population density for Jacksonville is 1,200. No, it's really not 1,200. So if you're looking at a city like Jacksonville, to compare it by square mileage to Chicago would make absolutely no sense, since the entire Duval County is city limits, but only a small portion of that county is actually urban. I say all that to say that in theory, with a lower homicide rate than Chicago and a tenth of the population density of Chicago, technically, right, you would think that your chances of running into a murder in Jacksonville would be completely obsolete and impossible. But in reality, somebody got shot right outside of my hotel room. So you have to take all that into account when you look at these numbers. So sometimes it's not just looking at information and drawing a conclusion. You can draw that conclusion with Oklahoma City or Kansas City, but when you look at Jacksonville, for example, you can't really draw the same conclusion. Even though it's got a lower population density, in reality, that population density, don't forget to note that most of Duval County is nothing but wooded areas. Why is this car shaking so much? A much better example would be Memphis, Tennessee, where there's only 2,000 people per square mile, but a homicide rate 3 to 4 times higher than Chicago, depending on the year. Memphis, Tennessee is a much more dangerous and scary city than Chicago by far, but Memphis, Tennessee is very spread out and would make a better example. But even Memphis, Tennessee, a city considerably more dangerous than Chicago, you're only talking that the homicide rate is like 2 to 3 times higher, but the population density is a 6. So when you put those numbers together, you're still closer to a homicide in Chicago than you are in Memphis by proximity and distance. And that's kind of what I want you guys to understand, that yes, if you live in Chicago, you're seeing all types of crazy stuff all the time, because you're in a city that has a homicide rate of about 20 to 22 per 100,000, and it's 12,000 people per square mile. You're definitely constantly in proximity to crime. But analytically, it's still safer than Birmingham, Jackson, Kansas City, definitely Memphis, Detroit, and all those other cities. And I think that's what distorts a lot of people's perception of why they think Chicago is a dangerous city, when in reality, it is actually analytically safer. So we have perception, we have reality, we have analytics, and we have misinformation. This is the best explanation I can give you into why Chicago feels more dangerous than it is. But I think beyond the feel and the perception, there's also the intention to make cities like Chicago look bad, because it is, after all, a very Democrat city. And today, cities like Chicago that are very Democrat are under a propaganda campaign by right-wing people to defame these cities and make them look very dangerous. Of course, they would never do the same thing with a city like Birmingham or Jackson, because they're in a very red conservative state, and then it brings up other questions. In other words, the reason Chicago fits that narrative better is because it's in a Democrat city in a Democrat state. But that's just people politicking. We don't deal with politic information. We deal with real life analytics. And I hope that today's video can shed some light on you if you've wondered, is Chicago dangerous? If you were to move to Chicago, you would definitely see 4 to 8 times more crime and violence in this city than you would in any of the other cities we've mentioned. But it's not because Chicago is more dangerous. It's because it's a more compact city.